In this episode, I'm going to create the basic outline of a sample long-term conflict. And I'm going to be using perhaps one of the most iconic humanoids in all of fantasy literature and D&D, the orc. But in order to justify the time and work it takes to develop a long-term story arc that plays itself out over many gaming sessions, these orcs can't just be the brutal simpletons driven by bloodlust and their instincts. They need to be something a little more interesting. So, of course, some members of the various, orc and raiding parties are going to be our traditional view of them, brutal warriors who think only of destroying their enemies. But the leaders have to be something more. And in fact, they should have views that are perhaps disturbingly close to the views held by the player characters. A desire to live freely on their traditional homelands, to raise their family without fear of being pushed off by outsiders. And then as I develop this further, there will come one orc whose prowess in warfare is only bested by the shrewdness of his tactical and strategic thinking, and perhaps his realization, with the player's help, that there might be a solution to his dilemma that isn't just based on victory or defeat. So this long-term conflict becomes, in large part, a story about this one unique orc, who is known to both his foes and allies as Kurok, the Anointed One. Hello again, folks. KR King here again, helping one and all homebrew their own campaign. So in the last episode, I talked about creating long-term conflicts, giving some sort of basic overview of that, and then I promised to start a sample longbrew comment in this video and some future ones. So as I mentioned in my intro, I'm going to be using orcs as the humanoid race that's opposing the players, in part because of their iconic status as, competitors with the player characters, and you also have the mixing with the half orcs as potential player characters. And also, I think that they give you opportunities for a more nuanced and complicated view of, the way orcs operate, their goals and motivations. And that last point is very important because I know there's a lot of debate among players as to how orcs should be played. Should they be the traditional orcs of the Lord of the Rings saga? Savage, evil, much stronger than many other races, but inherently less intelligent. And then there are those who want to, rehabilitate them and have orcs, run the gamut in terms of their characteristics and abilities, and not make them just this inherently evil, creature. Now, I'll admit, for many, many years, my friends and I always played orcs from the traditional view, cruel, evil, and stupid. We just felt they were a completely made up thing, and the people that made them up in terms of the game, TSR and Wizards of the Coast, basically adhered to that view in the monster manuals all the way up to 5e. Now, we've all heard Tasha's call it, everything is going to change all this. It's going to eliminate some of these racial characteristics, lowering intelligence or strength or whatever. And they're going to go back and reprint the manuals. I've heard the monster manuals to reflect this. If you want to do that, you can. If you want to play them, the way they used to be or whatever, that's all up to you. What I will say is I have always found the alignment system in D&D to be arbitrary and unrealistic. We only have one set of humanoids to base our conceptions of alignment, human beings, and human beings run the gamut of alignments. Very few people are wholly good or wholly evil. And even if you assert, well, I think most people are basically lawful good under all circumstances, what about during a war or a disaster or when they're threatened or tempted? Because is there a price on every level of lawful good? So if that's what we're basing our conception of alignments on in the game, why should humanoids and sentient creatures not run the gamut of alignments? So I've always held that orcs are sort of like the legendary view of the Vikings. And I say legendary because I don't really know what Vikings were like, but I imagine that they prized warfare among all activities. They gave no quarter nor expected any in battle, and they plundered weaker peoples, as a way of life. Another example of this is the Klingons in the later editions of the Star Trek series. And the various player characters, like the people that dealt with the Vikings, might consider those attributes that they prize as to be evil or even chaotic evil. But I would wager that Orcs' activities, like Vikings or Klingons, aren't really so chaotic at all. They have rules of behavior, they have norms in their culture. I don't imagine Vikings living in cities or becoming shopkeepers, but I'll bet you there were some. I don't think of Vikings as diplomats or philosophers, but I'll bet you there were some. So I would imagine that there are orcs that don't happen to be very strong, but are very smart. There's many that aren't filled with bloodlust all day long. But the norms of their culture would pressure most orcs to adopt this warlike ethos to their way of life. All right, so having established what I think about orcs, you're trying to create a long-term conflict. So you have to create these circumstances that conflict can be maintained. If it's an individual creature or whatever the players encounter, the creature should, if it's defeated, it should escape so that it can then come back to haunt the players. I used the example of the green hag in my earlier video. And if it's a larger group and the players defeat them, a certain number can escape, or there can be a even larger number that weren't part of that battle. And obviously when you have a group, as I'm going to have in this example, the leader of the group is usually encountered maybe one time before, but he's pretty much going to be for the final showdown. And this is the model I'm going to use for this example, the group model, in which the players slowly but surely come into contact with various orcs working under this Kurok, the anointed one, until finally they meet him. But Kurok is going to rise in experience and tactics and whatnot as the players do. And as I said in that earlier video, geography is very important as well, because typically the player characters and their enemies are going to be fighting in some sense over shared turf. Now, this means that these creatures are not just wandering through this area, but they have some kind of claim to the area. So you could have a wandering creature that just comes by, encounters the player, and develops some long-term hatred of them, but it's much more likely if they've decided to settle in the area. Most creatures have to have a place to sleep at night. And we typically choose the same place because it's familiar, because it's safer. When you're in a familiar place, you're much more liable to notice that something is out of order. So with that shared geography comes shared history. This, of course, depends on how long your opponents have been in an area as opposed to the players. And even if they're newcomers, are their attitudes towards these creatures in the general world, in the history of the world. So I'm using orcs that have a kind of interesting history in terms of Melanor, this frontier continent that I have established, in that they haven't been seen in the area in any numbers in 50 years. Why? Because that's when there was this great Orcan war in which the orcs rose up, tried to drive the various player character races off their areas, and they were defeated. This war was 50 years before the current playing time, but the players would certainly know the history of this thing, and it would shape their attitudes. But even more importantly, the descendants of the orcs, those that survived the war, also know this history and also have attitudes about it. And thinking always of this shared history is essential to world building. It's essential to the verisimilitude of your world and thinking up ways to tie in the storylines with this history. So in my first videos on creating a world, I talked about using the frontier world. These various player character races came to the continent of Melanor, was undiscovered. This was 200 years ago, and they settled. And the idea was simplicity. I only have 3 major settlements. I have 200 years of history. Again, this Orcan War came 50 years ago, because when you have settlers colonizing a world, they come into conflict with the indigenous peoples that are already there. And in this case, it was the orcs. The way I'm setting this up was when the people came and started settling, the orcs had disparate tribes that often fought with each other as much as with these new settlers. Then what happened was you had a leader arise, Dragnok the Destroyer, and he united the Orcan tribes. He said, we need to drive them into the sea once and for all. And the orcs had numbers, but they lacked the technology, access to magic that these new settlers had. And I centered this around what I call the Barren Hills, which is near Dramos. This is sacred ground to the orcs. They began harassing villages, then beginning more and more concentrated attacks. As the various tribes saw the success of Dragnok, they joined his side. Suddenly they had huge numbers, and basically all the settlements had to join up everybody, who could bear arms had to rise up, and they defeated Dragnok in this epic battle. And not only was Dragnok killed and most of his followers, the few that did survive were literally hunted down. And in terms of the history of this war, these actions were justified by the atrocities that Dragnok and his orcs committed against citizens. But to the Orcan side, this was a bitter loss. It was a heroic struggle to regain lost territory. And just as the victors were celebrated throughout the settlements of Melanor, so too were the losers on the Orcan side. And I'm saying that every Orcan dwelling has a little picture of Dragnok, and the memory of his many victories before the final loss are celebrated. All right, so the players are aware of this history, as are the Orcs. Now I want to think about creating a figure who's going to rise up and unite the Orcs once again. So I'm going to create this character, Kurok the Anointed, and he got his nickname because Dragnok's grandson, Durzum, realized that this was an Orc. Not only did he have great military prowess, but he had a very shrewd mind. And he declared, this is the one that's going to save us. And part of the great strength of Kurok is his sense of caution, which we don't often associate with Orcs. So he's going to have high intelligence and wisdom, along with the usual strength and dexterity, which makes him an exceptional figure. Again, as I said in my earlier video, you want to make your opponents worthy opponents. So since Kurok is intelligent and wise, he comes to the realization that the newcomers they're not going to be driven into the sea or forced to get in their ships and sail back to Ambar. So what he wants is recognition among these settlers that the Barren Hills is traditional sacred ground to the Orcs. But he's not going to have like a diplomatic mission or anything, because that's not the way it's going to work in this fantasy, medieval setting. It's based on power and force of arms. So what he realizes is that he needs to establish a fait accompli. The idea that if the Orcs have established themselves in the hills in such a way that the settlers are going to have to rise up again for some massive army, but he convinces them that instead of all this bloodshed, just let us live in peace. Perhaps the settlers will accept it. But this is a long way down the road, right? When the players first start in this long-term conflict, they're not going to meet Kurok. They're not going to know anything about him. They're just going to start to encounter these Orcs in a way that it all begins to unfold, that something's different, both in their tactics, their aims, the way they're operating. And this makes it easier for you as a GM. You don't have to know the stats on every single Orc, the allies of Kurok, other humanoids, sentient creatures, devils, fiends, whatever. You don't have to do all that. You can develop that as you go along, sketch it out, then begin with a simple encounter with the players, and then build from there. So that first encounter you make appropriate to your player character's levels, then you begin to leave clues, both physical and behavioral, that something's afoot. Okay, so now I have the idea of Kurok, the Orc. I have the shared history and the geography for the players. So I'm going to use 5 PCs that I'm currently running within an online campaign. And when they first have this encounter, the PCs are going to be at 3rd level, so I'm going to scale this initial encounter. I'm going to make it a difficult encounter, but not necessarily deadly to begin with. I'm going to think about the player character's classes in terms of how this encounter unfolds. The idea being to give each of them an opportunity to use their unique talents in this encounter. I'm going to use the greater history of the world to frame the encounter in terms of the player character's attitudes about Orcs and the mystery of why they're here. But then I'm going to use the personal histories of the characters to give them an access or entree into that encounter. So what I'm thinking is the classic 7 samurai, Magnificent 7 sort of encounter, in which the player characters come to the aid of a village under duress. So the Orcs will be, raiding livestock and destroying property, but in a very deliberate fashion. The authorities of Dramos were alerted of this. They actually sent some soldiers out to patrol, but whenever the soldiers are there, the Orcs never attack. They can't really garrison soldiers there. It's a small village. It's not really worth it. When the soldiers leave, the Orcs return. Now, these tactics may change depending on how the players respond. I'm going to let them decide, how do we protect this village? How is this going to go about? Again, if they're confused, there will be villagers that I have to create, a leader to the village and this sort of thing, which I'm going to do in my next video. So if you like what you've seen so far, please subscribe. I can't wait to keep going with this encounter. Please leave comments on, long-term conflicts again. But as always, my friends, In the meantime, keep playing D&D and tell somebody else about it.